Alrighty, what's good? In today's video, I wanted to go ahead and answer some questions that I've been getting asked about some real estate video tricks and things that people see me do. And they're like, well, how did you do that? So in today's video, I thought I would combine a couple of different tips and tricks that will help better your videos and also increase your efficiency. Let's get started. What's good, everybody? Ken here. You're watching OriginaldoBo, and today we're going to talk about some real estate tips and tricks. But first, I do need, I did hit the record button on the audio. This is the third take because I forgot to record audio. But today I want to talk about shooting real estate video, and I want to give you some tips that I haven't really talked about before, and some tips that have taken me a long time to really figure out and implement into my workflow. So one of the questions I received recently was, how do I stabilize my footage if I'm using Premiere Pro, and how do I do my speed ramps? So I'm gonna sort of combine this all into one here. So first things first, I think a lot of people get this wrong when they are slowing down their footage. Now, I do shoot my videos in 60 frames per second. However, when I export that video out, it does come out in a 23.96 or 97 timeline. It's a 9.6 or 9.7. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it doesn't matter. It's a second off. It doesn't really matter. But that's what I export it out to. But when I take that footage in, how do I slow it down? Well, I used to right click and choose a speed, like set it to 50% or 40% of the speed that it was before. But I found a better way to do this. So right now today in Premiere Pro, if you slow down a clip and try to stabilize it, it's gonna make you nest that clip. Now, nesting's not a terrible thing to do. It does keep things a little bit more organized and neat, but here's an easier way to do this. Before you take your clip and drop it into your timeline, right click on whatever source footage it is that you're gonna bring into your editor and click Modify. When you click Modify, you'll simply just choose the correct frame rate you want. In my case, it's 23.96, and I drop it into the timeline. Boom, my clip's already slowed down, and that's it. Now, what's even cooler about this, I can go ahead and take some warp stabilizer, drop it on the clip, and I'm done. Now, for me, as far as warp stabilization goes, if I had a really sort of smooth walk with some minimal jitter or bobble, maybe 5% will do it just right. Now, some people argue like 2% or 1%, but at that point, why do it? I rather just hit it for 5%. I don't really mind the additional crop because it's not doing a lot of damage. What I have noticed though, since I started using the Panasonic, the in-body image stabilization in this plus a gimbal is absolutely stupendous, and I find myself using a lot less warp stabilizer than I ever had before, but not everybody has that luxury, so about 5% will do you just right. All right, let's talk about speed ramping, because this is something that I get asked quite frequently is, how do I speed ramp my videos and when should I speed ramp? Well, for starters, I am not a big proponent of speed ramping. Personally, I don't like speed ramping videos. That's just me, simply because I think speed ramps are one of the most overdone things in real estate. And it's also one of those things that people do wrong so often. They just speed ramp way too much, and it just takes you out of the video as a viewer. So speed ramps should only be used in certain situations when you're trying to pass through or bypass something that is not interesting. Don't just add like random speed ramps as you're parallaxing to something. One of the most common things is, if this is a countertop, I see somebody turn and all of a sudden they're like, why? Why would you do that? Just keep the motion smooth or cut it short, but don't speed ramp that. If you are going to speed ramp, my best suggestion to you is to try to keep your speed ramp really short and really flowy and fluid. 200 to 400% of an increase on most speed ramps is really acceptable. Also, don't take really long pieces of a speed ramp. You want to keep them short, but you also want to make sure your speed ramp is tapered. The easiest way to do this is to bevel each of the sides and put sort of a Bezier on it, and it sort of makes it a little bit more natural when it slows up and speeds up and slows down. Slows up, you can't slow up. When you slow down and speed up, it just makes it look a lot more natural. The other suggestion I have for this is, if you are going to stabilize a clip and add speed ramping, make sure your clip is stabilized, then nest the clip, then do your speed ramp. Don't speed ramp, then stabilize, because a lot of times if there are any jitters or sort of warpy sensations in your video, the speed ramp is going to amplify the stabilization. So make sure you stabilize first, nest, so it becomes like a brand new clip again that's stable, then do your speed ramp, and you will find that you will have a much better result. All right, next tip is resolution and frame rate. So like I said, I shoot 60 frames per second. Not every camera has the ability to shoot in 4K. And honestly, I bought all my cameras with the intention that I was going to be shooting in 4K. But I've actually started shooting a lot in 1080p. And I shoot a lot in 1080p because the files look perfectly fine. I don't notice any degradation or difference between the two files, especially where I'm viewing them. Typically, it's going to a multi-listing site or Zillow, which Zillow can't take 4K files anyways, nor can most social media sites like Facebook and Twitter. There's no 4K uploads. I mean, you can upload 4K, but you're just not going to be able to see it because of the resolution compression. So there's just no point. And it's also added waste on your resources to shoot in 4K. There's a misconception that resolution will increase the overall sharpness, and it's sort of true, but it's also has nothing to do with that. A lot of times your sharpness is going to come from the glass that you are using. I'm going to talk more about this in just a second because this is going to blow some of your minds that I do this, but it's absolutely true. So 1080p 60 frames per second is what I use, and honestly, I've had no problems with it in even the highest end listings. I've never had an agent ask me if I was shooting in 4K. They're just not going to do it. Once it hits Facebook and the MLS, it's going to get compressed. There's going to be artifacts in it. You're just not going to notice all those little finite details. The only way I would say 4K is really worth it is if you're trying to punch in or crop on something, then yes, 4K would be worth it in that instance. But beyond that, save yourself the headache, the hassle of shooting in 4K and just shoot in 1080p. Now, there are some instances where I would say that you'd probably want to shoot in 4K, and that would be one of the instances if you have a camera that does a better bit rate at a higher resolution like 4K. Like the older Sonys, the a6400s, the a6300s, I had better luck shooting in 4K because the file just didn't look as good in 1080p. And that's just because Sony just notoriously has soft 1080p. But for Fuji, Panasonic, and Canon, I always found that the 1080p files to come out really sharp and overall super pleasing. So take that for what it is, but give 1080p a try. It'll definitely increase your workflow. All right, let's talk about my next tip, and it's about the aperture. Shoot at a higher aperture. So take, for instance, this lens right here. This is a Lumix 16 to 35 millimeter f4. It's a constant aperture f4 lens, and most people would say, well, this is great for photos, but for video, it's not going to be enough because I need a really super fast lens for real estate walkthrough videos. And that's not true. You don't need a super fast lens to be able to get really bright, crisp imagery out of your camera. The reality is that most mirrorless cameras today can totally handle bumping up your ISO. For instance, if you shoot on a Sony camera, you can bump up your ISO to a tremendous amount. For instance, this shot here where I was outside doing some twilight video of this $1 million listing we did, I had the ISO cranked up to right about 20,000, and it was coming out really, really clean. And that was with an f4, Sony f4 10 to 18 millimeter lens, and I was able to get some great results. Most of the time when I'm going through a house, my lens is at f4 to f5. I don't really go much over that, but f4 to f5 ensures that everything is totally in focus and really, really razor sharp. I think the biggest misconception is that people try to get these super fast lenses and they misfocus more often than not. If they just put it at f4 or f5, you're gonna get a sharper image. And if you are using APS-C, f3, f3.5 is totally feasible. I shoot at f4 to f5 on full frame, and that works out just well for me. You can raise your ISO. There is really, really minimal degradation to your files by raising the ISO. Most cameras today have a dual native ISO, so you actually have 2 points in which you can raise that ISO. Now I shoot in log, and because I shoot in log, it does have dual native ISO on both the Fuji and the Panasonic. The Fuji is at, I think, 2000 and 640. And this one, the Panasonic S5, is at 640 and 4000 ISO, which gives me a little bit room for flexibility in post, of course. But even without dual native ISO, I've seen Sony cameras go way up, super, super high, and have very, very limited issues. Now, if you do shoot on Canon, I would be a little bit more conscious of that, of how high you do go. It's something you'll want to test before you go into a location so you know the threshold of what your camera can take, but don't be afraid to bump the ISO. It's perfectly fine. There is noise reductions for that you can put in post. So there you go. I hope these tips help you because these are things that have taken me a little bit of time to figure out. There's a lot of misconceptions on a lot of these videos that I see people put out. Not every listing is going to be a super pristine listing where there's optimal lighting. A lot of the houses that I do shoot are just the worst case scenarios, which are just suburban homes with not a lot of lighting, and they're just not your $1 million listing. They're going to be more of what the average Joe shooter will typically see when they're first starting out. So try these tips out. If it works for you, let me know in the comments section. I love hearing success stories. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at OriginaldoBo. I'll be more than happy to answer any and all of your questions. And stay original. See you next time.